Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring a really important topic within the history of psychology. It also marks sort of the end of our discussion of not only cognitive topics, but the transition of topics that we've been going through in the previous lectures. This topic that we're going to be looking at is intelligence. And its importance within the history of psychology is something we'll be addressing as this lecture progresses. And just note that right off the bat, this was one of the game-changing things that put psychology on the map, in conjunction with some of the work of Freud. So we don't want to not only kind of underplay its importance, but get lost in some of the debates that happen when addressing this really critical idea. So let's get started and start this class in sort of a unique way. Now, when we talk about intelligence and the challenges around how people have kind of argued about what to study with intelligence, I always like to, just so people can get some perspective, start this topic out, especially when we're doing it in person, with a discussion where I ask people to do something kind of odd. I argue that most of us probably have some innate idea of who's intelligent and who's not, and have some concept of how we glean intelligence from others. But I challenge people in this activity to think up a way to actually quantify a person's level of intelligence and potentially use that quantification to compare the mental abilities of one person to another. Now, mind you, since we're doing this in a hypothetical world, I would say that you can't just say use an IQ test to measure somebody's intelligence, right? That's what was developed by individuals trying to find ways to compare cognitive abilities of one person to the other. So people really are just in this activity asked to speak with each other and talk about some things that maybe they need to be concerned with and things that they would really want to focus on when devising these first early intelligence tests. This again was exactly what early psychologists trying to study intelligence were trying to do. If you want to, feel free to pause me, think about some things, but I think now is a good time to transition to sort of the point of this activity. So if we were doing this activity in person, what we would often find is a bunch of students volunteering responses about things that they would use to determine intelligence, but also some concerns that they would have with the multitude of different tests that people were coming up with. We would start talking about how intelligence seems to be a very multifaceted thing and how sometimes the tests might miss critical aspects of intelligence. There's often the mention of things like book smarts versus street smarts, and whether or not intelligence really has much of a predictor on a bunch of different things that we tend to tie it to. And this is something that intelligence researchers have been mindful of since the early research on this started over 100 years ago. And nonetheless, what intelligence researchers were tasked to do is come up with some overarching definition that we could use to talk about this general idea of intelligence being tied to different variations in people's cognitive skills. So the definition that most psychologists use when trying to define intelligence usually revolves around the ability to adapt, learn, and solve problems. This sort of makes sense, right? If we're talking about cognitive skills, usually your ability to adapt to things is a byproduct of how well you've developed some of the things like attention and problem solving and memory, concepts we've again already explored in this class. But it's really interesting to note that within this definition of intelligence, even though there is the assumption that some of these things might help, it's not necessarily inherent that these things are required for somebody to score high on some sort of intelligence test that's looking at problem-solving abilities or adaptability. And in fact, some things that we often link to intelligence don't inherently go with that definition of intelligence. You probably know individuals that will be described by others as street smart or just very socially adept, ones with really good interpersonal skills. And one would argue that oftentimes the ability to interact with others is a very helpful thing. But whether or not that fits, especially the textbook definition of intelligence, is very debatable. And if we look at a lot of the intelligence tests that we're going to be talking about as we progress, we'll notice very quickly that a lot of those, what we maybe call street smart skills, certainly aren't in a lot of the intelligence tests that we've devised over the years. Same thing can also be said for memory capacity. We recognize that utilizing our memory successfully is a critical aspect to intelligence, but we don't necessarily, in this definition, link a very large, robust memory capacity with being more intelligent. Even though, if you've ever met somebody that does seem to have this innate ability to remember everything, you might, in your mind, link that to intelligence. Same thing with vocabulary usage. There's no bonus points for having a robust vocabulary in an intelligence test, unless, I'm guessing, if you've ever met somebody who sounds more like an encyclopedia than a person, you've probably had those inklings that this person is not, well, dull. And this also goes with novel ideas. And if somebody can be creative, come up with really interesting solutions to things, there's no bonus points in many of the intelligence tests for coming up with creative ways to solve problems. It's just the ability to solve them that's the focus of many intelligence researchers. But what I want you to get from this is that this is a really challenging topic to not only explore, but just to define. Because even though we have this innate sense that we'd like to be able to quantify and compare people's cognitive abilities, it's an area that is of particular interest to a lot of people, which particular cognitive skills we focus on, how we determine what we're going to measure, is something that's open for debate. And this is what a lot of the early years of intelligence research was all about, trying to solve this debate and kind of carve a path forward so subsequent intelligence research could be conducted. And in fact, even as the field started to grow, new debates after testing was devised started to pop up. One of the debates that people started really getting into in the 1930s and 40s and even beyond is this question of if intelligence is just a one-dimensional thing. One of the early researchers on this topic that tried to utilize a lot of statistical tools that we had at our disposal in the early 1930s was a gentleman named Charles Spearman, who utilized this really cool thing that we had started to use in a lot of our science called the correlational coefficient. It's not necessarily something that we consider that impressive or amazing today. We just use it in a lot of our research, but at the time, Spearman was a very forward-thinking individual when he found ways to collect all of this data for individuals across multiple types of intelligence tests that we'd had early on devised to see if he could find these correlation coefficients that indicated whether or not there were differences between the different types of intelligence test performance we had. And what Spearman's research suggested was that even though individuals did have certain things that they could be slightly better than others, most individuals tended to have some underlying level of performance across all the different types of intelligence that you could test. And Spearman argued that if we really wanted to be concrete with what intelligence was, maybe this kind of underlying factor is what we should use to define intelligence. So he suggested, instead of just looking at a person's verbal skills or numerical skills or any other type of skill we're interested in, let's just measure them on a whole bunch of things that we argue are a part of intelligence tests and find some corollary level for each of the different things that these people are getting measured on and use that score, not the correlation, but the score that comes from it, as a person's intelligence. This was something he eventually called the G factor, or general level of intelligence within an individual. Spearman's work, once he started to come up with these G's factors, expanded into looking at what's maybe behind these things. Now, much to Spearman's credit, he not only was ahead of his time when it came to using some of these psychometric approaches that relied on statistics to find a way to quantify intelligence, but he was also ahead of his time in his attempts to link these levels of intelligence to things beyond, I don't know, genetic proclivity or specific races that people were a part of, which unfortunately was a lot of the focus for a lot of early intelligence researchers. Spearman argued that a lot of these things were nonsensical, and if we controlled for things like environment and childhood health and other kind of environmental factors, well, there's a good chance that we could have a pretty good sense of what a person's general level of intelligence was, and it would be pretty similar to a lot of other people. So his main contention essentially was that our intelligence levels, what made us unique, were probably those experiences that we had, not only as a young child, but as we progressed throughout all of our cognitive development. Another person who looked at this same idea, about how we could separate out intelligence, was a gentleman named Robert Sternberg, who came up with this idea that one level of intelligence was probably insufficient to really be able to tease out what made a person unique. He specifically proposed that we probably had 3 different types of intelligence that were unique and maybe, even though they overlap sometimes, could be distinct in a way that somebody could be strong in one thing where they were weak in another. Now, Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence was something that was constantly evolving as he was pushing it. He came up with 3 factors in a number of different ways and kept trying to find ways to fine-tune his research. And unfortunately, one of the biggest issues with a lot of Sternberg's ideas was the fact that he kept finding, even though he kept devising new types of intelligence that he was swearing were part of this triarchic theory, he kept finding that these traits, these levels of intelligence, across whatever 3 he came up with, are often very highly correlated with each other. In fact, some people argue that Sternberg in his work might have been a pretty big, not necessarily advocate, but a big component to people supporting Spearman's theory more. Because essentially, despite his insistence that we had 3 levels of intelligence, he kept seemingly finding just one underlying level of intelligence that was there. In fact, because of that, not a lot of people in intelligence research circles focus a lot of their attention on Robert Sternberg these days. But they do sometimes use his ideas to kind of springboard into other, more kind of current theories about intelligence. And one of the people that did this, that many people do celebrate, is a big kind of monumental figure in a shift of focus in intelligence research, is a gentleman named Howard Gardner, who in the 1980s and beyond started pushing this theory of multiple intelligences. His argument was that we might indeed have a G factor, an underlying level of intelligence that really does relate with a lot of different types of intelligence that we might possess. But he also insisted that we also probably have these things that pop up, these skill sets that we develop through experience or some innate ability that might cause us to perform really high on a specific aspect of intelligence test. So Gardner set out to look at not just 3 different types of intelligence that might exist, but a multitude of them. For a long period of time, he had about 9 different intelligences, and now he's got a few more, if I recall correctly, that he contended were all things that we wanted to measure with an individual, and all things that could be very useful if we really wanted to understand what would make somebody successful in a specific environment. He contended that if I wanted to know what job you would be best at or what program you would really thrive in, I didn't want to just know your general intelligence. I wanted to know your intelligence across all these different dimensions. You might be able to find a good fit for you. Now, if we were in an in-person class right now, I'd be pulling up a video of Howard Gardner sort of introducing his theory, talking about why he felt it was so important, and also discussing a really interesting idea. That was the notion that a lot of the early intelligence tests that we developed are sort of capped and limited. And even though they might have put psychology on the map, he thought that finding ways to revise these intelligence tests was critical to the future of intelligence research. And to an extent, there's some validity to his argument that he would have made in that video that we could have potentially watched. Nonetheless, even if we don't necessarily jump on his ideas, it's important to note that Gardner really did add to a very interesting conversation about this idea of intelligence. And it's one that we're still sort of grappling with today. But instead of going down a couple other avenues, which we will eventually do, I do want to turn our focus to something that Gardner would have mentioned in that video. He talks about how in the early 1900s, psychology was just this fledgling science. It was intelligence tests, finding ways to kind of calculate out mental scores, something that really did put psychology on the map. And in his statement, he's definitely pointing out something that I do want you to be aware of. In the early 1900s, as psychology was forming, Sigmund Freud, a lot of his followers, and the work of intelligence researchers were really the things that caused psychology to go from this fringe science to something that was extremely mainstream and something that many people found applicable in their everyday lives. This might lead you to ask, what were these intelligence tests? Well, even in its infancy, intelligence tests were always designed to be tools for researchers to compare the cognitive abilities of one person to the other. But how these tools were developed, what they were used for, very dramatically in our history of psychology. I do want to give us just a brief overview of how these intelligence tests have evolved over the years, so we have a better sense of how we got to where we are today. Now, even though there's some debate about who came up with the very first intelligence test ever, in fact, it's probably impossible to really know this because intelligence was something we were interested in long before psychology was a true science. But the first person to develop a mass-distributed intelligence test ever was a gentleman named Alfred Binet, who actually devised this test not necessarily because he wanted to become famous or do something monumental, but because he was trying to solve a specific problem that his government, in particular the French Ministry of Education, was facing at the time. See, in the early 1900s, much of Europe was going through a really tumultuous era. I mean, obviously, there were lots of external factors that you probably have learned about in your history classes, but just from an educational standpoint, I want to understand that these countries did not have a lot of money, and they were very worried that their investments in education and other systems would be wasted. So what the French Ministry of Education decided to do was search through their school systems, in particular their early elementary school systems, to see if they could find any things within it that were problematic, any things that were maybe causing the kids in those groups to not benefit from the education system that they devised as much as they could. And what they deemed, after kind of doing these analyses, if we're going to call them analyses, there seemed to be a lot of children within these educational systems that were sort of holding everybody back. They were ones that were not necessarily getting the most out of the classes on their own. More importantly, as they were not getting things out of the class on their own, they were taking away the resources of some of their classmates. This kind of multi-pronged problem was what the French Ministry of Education wanted Binet's help with. In particular, they wanted him to help detect children that were what they called not profiting from a traditional education system, so they could get them out of the classrooms and find ways to get them help while also allowing the traditional classrooms to be a little bit more efficient, to, I guess, get their money's worth, you might say. So they tasked Binet with one of his colleagues named Theodore Simon to come up with the very first intelligence tests, one that was really devised to look at just basic cognitive skills of very young children. In these tests, he'd ask people to come up with sentences for specific words, or he'd point to different parts of the body and ask them to give them names, or he'd give them very small strings of numbers, or small numbers of items that he would ask them to remember and then repeat back to them. None of these tests would be anything that, say, a young adult would struggle with, but if you were 3, 4, 5, there would be some challenges to some of these tests, and more importantly, there would be a great degree of difference from child to child in their ability to perform some of these tasks. These differences were the specific thing that Binet and Simon would use to actually measure the intelligence levels, if we're going to call it that, of his children. Now, specifically, what they would do in these tests was they would find around 10 children per each age group and figure out what an average child at, say, age 3, or 4, or 5, or 6, all the way up would do. Now, from these 50 children, Binet and Simon were able to sort of establish a baseline, but it's important to note that these original scales were sort of altered a bit as their research expanded. So it's not that all intelligence scores in the original Binet-Simon tests were just based off of 10 kids aged 3 that they thought were kind of average. Instead, it was based off of originally that, and then the tests continued to move and alter as they got a little bit better data, or just a little bit better sense of how a child performed. And from this, they were able to glean both a child's mental age and compare that mental age to their chronological age. As a reminder, Binet and Simon weren't necessarily interested in those that were excelling in the schools. They were interested in those that were struggling. So their main focus was to find children who had a younger mental age than a chronological age. Just a little bit younger, but significantly younger. If there was a 5-year-old performing like a 3-year-old, those would be the children that were flagged and again put into these special education systems or given extra sets of help. Now, Binet and Simon, after devising these tests, not only worked on trying to find a way to mass distribute them and tweak them to make them more applicable, I guess. It's also important to note that Binet and Simon spent a lot of their careers, well, their remaining careers, since Binet did die shortly after devising these tests, trying to set up programs and systems to help those that did show indications of struggling. They also started finding ways to kind of talk about this, and there were indicators that they did talk about a ratio of mental age to chronological age that we could sort of call a modern-day IQ, or intelligence quotient. This term, the IQ, is actually tied a little bit later to another individual in intelligence research's history. But before I talk about this next individual and his place in the history of psychology, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about some sort of side effects that came from the work of Binet and Simon. As Binet and Simon started to publish their work, as the French Ministry of Education started to utilize this, there was this growing recognition and interest within the intelligence research community and within really governments as a whole to try to figure out what this information could be used for. And unfortunately, there were a lot of debates going on in the early 1900s that built off of this intelligence research to spin some pretty unsavory and unfortunate debates. One of the things that lots of people started arguing when we started using this intelligence research was that those kids struggling in these schools, not ones that just had a tough upbringing or something else going on, but instead were part of a group of individuals that was just simply inferior to others. This idea led to a whole push of other researchers and scientists to try to show that specific skills in terms of performance on these cognitive tests could be tied not only from child to sibling, but also child to parent, or even group of individuals to group of individuals. It led to this whole notion that there were superior races, superior groups of individuals within countries, and just superior individuals overall based on this just very limited type of test that Binet and Simon had devised. And that eventually spun into a huge debate over whether or not if we could find indications that one specific race or group of individuals is superior to others, and whether or not it would be ethical to really promote that group and in doing so sort of demote other groups within society. This was something that is unfortunately still in circulation in certain groups today called the eugenics debate. This notion that we could essentially make a country or group of people better by just systematically breeding that group into this better dynamic. This also was tied to another push that came very quickly after Binet and Simon started to become popular. It was this need to find ways to not just test children, but to test adults, and to focus our attention not just on those that were struggling, but those that were superior to others. And this is what led us to the next individual we're going to be talking about, a gentleman that actually spent a large portion of his career at Stanford named Lewis Terman, who was a huge advocate of this eugenics debate and decided in his work to not just study young children, but look at a wide range of ages, coming up with standards for how everybody at different levels would perform. And in looking at more individuals at different ages, he needed to kind of create a much more elaborate test, because asking a 38-year-old what that thing on your arm was is probably not necessarily going to provide a lot of variations in responses. So what this new test, divided by Lewis Terman, did was looked at things like reasoning skills, mathematical skills, memory skills, in much more complex ways. In essence, it allowed people to have scores for the very first time on multiple dimensions of intelligence, and he used these performance scores to get what many people considered sort of the first IQ, first intelligence quotient, where somebody's mental age on some skill was divided by their chronological age, and that ratio was multiplied by 100 to make it easier to read, I guess. So if you were average, your mental age and chronological age were exactly the same, you'd get a score of about 100. This test that was devised by Terman was used partially for academic purposes, but it was also devised primarily as a tool to push his notion of genetics. And he called it, to really kind of give a name to it, the Stanford-Binet IQ test, named after both Alfred Binet, the person who devised the first intelligence test, and Stanford, the school that he was at when he really started to push this intelligence test across a wide range of communities. Now, this Stanford-Binet intelligence test did grow the popularity of intelligence tests even more. It led lots of people to use it in research and in lots of community settings for a multitude of different purposes. Some of them very unsavory, unfortunately, but others in more savory ways. Eventually, though, it led to this realization that even though these tests were interesting, there was definitely a need to revise them. Lots of inherent flaws within the Stanford-Binet test started to become very apparent, and it led to many people interested in cognitive abilities to find this need to develop new intelligence test measures. One of these individuals that had heard the calling and decided to try to revise these intelligence test measures for whatever purposes was a gentleman named David Wechsler. who noticed that a lot of the tests that were being administered in the Stanford-Binet test were flawed, either because there were huge cultural biases or just kind of outdated material being used within them. Another thing that Wechsler quickly realized was that the IQ scores that people were given were very age specific. He contended that to be way above average in, say, the 4 to 5 to 6 range is very common. Right? Somebody who just performed a few months better than their peers could have a very high IQ score if they were just a young child. But if you were in your 50s, 60s, and beyond, a lot of those IQ scores started to become sort of useless. And it was really tough to talk about performing 30 or 40 years better than your peers if you're, say, being tested in your 50s or 60s. So he did something which was really important in the development of intelligence tests. He did something called standardizing the tests. So he said, I'm no longer going to compare how you're doing based on your age to somebody else of a different age. I'm just going to compare everybody within the same age group to each other, talk about how you're doing with comparison to those individuals. So if you're right on par with everybody else, you'll still get an IQ score of 100, just like you would have on the Stanford-Binet test. When these Wechsler scales, we're going to say if you're better than a certain percentage of the population based on your performance, and you'll get an IQ score that's accordingly matched. So if you're, say, doing better than 84% of the population, as you see in the picture on the lower left-hand corner, then you'd get an IQ score of about 115. That denotes the standard deviation about 15, 15.4. Okay, just babbling here. It denotes a standard deviation of 15 for these intelligence tests. If you're doing better than, say, 98% of the population, then you get an IQ score of 130. And again, these tests, much like the Stanford-Binet test, measured a whole bunch of different cognitive aspects, and it measured people in two different tests. Anybody under the age of 16 would take something called the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. Anybody taking these tests as adults, well, 16 and up, would take something called the WAIS. And Wechsler contended that this helped for a lot of the age issues that were also prevalent in the Stanford-Binet tests, where adults were being given way too easy questions oftentimes, and children were given way too difficult questions where they had really zero chance of answering them. Essentially, two birds were killed with one stone by creating these multifaceted tests that looked at either children or adults, because you got better data and didn't have to ask questions that were useless. And again, as I mentioned, these tests did measure a multitude of different things that allowed for them to control for cultural issues and population issues and lots of other types of kind of quirks to the original tests that were devised by Lewis Terman. These tests do have a lot of new, interesting dynamics to them that you might encounter at some point in time. And that's because these tests have been not only kind of constantly revised since they were introduced by David Wechsler a number of decades ago, they're ones that have started to kind of find their way, they did find their way into a lot of psychological communities. And in fact, the clinical community uses the Wechsler scales more often than not in a large number of tests that they administer to individuals when cognitive skills and cognitive abilities are of interest. There's also a lot of just basic intelligence measures that you might take, even if you don't have clinical issues, that come from these Wechsler scales, all of which have, again, been continually revised and diversified themselves enough to really give us a sense of where one person's intelligence levels lie with respect to the rest of the population. It's not saying that these things are flawless. It's not saying that these things are the end of the conversation. But in terms of the development of intelligence tests, the Wechsler scales were a pretty darn monumental thing, because they finally gave us a more scientific, standardized intelligence test that has been in circulation for a long period of time. It's also something that's helped us control for one of the major issues that people have had with intelligence tests even since their inception. Even though most people don't think Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon had a lot of unsavory ideas when they were developing their first intelligence tests, the unfortunate after effects of these developments cannot be overlooked. When people started to look at these intelligence tests, their attempts to use it to show that specific cultures or groups of individuals were inferior to others was a persistent focus for many, many years. And in the design of a lot of these tests, these cultural problems were either intentionally or unintentionally included in them. And what it caused was this huge issue where if somebody was given a test in a language they weren't familiar with or in a society that they weren't very accustomed to, they would inherently score really low on these intelligence tests, and those low scores would be used as indications not of them not being from those cultures, but instead of being intellectually inferior to others. As we started to recognize these huge problems, a lot of the later tests, ones that Wechsler incorporated into his scales and ones that other researchers have continued to try to create over the years, a lot of these tests have been designed in ways that sort of go around or get around these conceptual problems, these biases that shouldn't be a part of intelligence tests. And a lot of really cool designs have been developed in an attempt to overcome these. And whether or not they completely overcome our inherent cultural biases is something that's up for debate. And whether or not we can control for other issues in the testing format and the design of the way these tests are administered is another hot debate that's risen recently. But it hopefully, when we look at these new designs, can speak to something that has been happening in this field for the last couple decades. This new push within the community to try to diversify these tests in a way that kind of remove a lot of the egocentric thinking that existed within them for the first almost century of them being devised. It's also let us find a way to more scientifically explore a lot of the early questions that intelligence researchers had. One of the questions, again, that many people started to ask in the early 1900s when our first intelligence tests came up was, where was this intelligence coming from? Nowadays, we, in talking about it in a scientific way, link this to an idea of something called heritability. Today's heritability research focuses much less on societal heritability or cultural heritability and more on the debate between what we call nature and nurture. How much of a person's predispositions for not only intellectual levels but personality levels or other things is a byproduct of nature, which is something found within our biology. In this case, we say heritability is high, or our nurture, or a byproduct of the environment, the social world we find ourselves in. If something is more linked to nurture, we say that the heritability of something is low. When we do statistical analyses on intelligence test performance on a lot of our more modern tests, what we tend to find is that there is a fairly decent amount of heritability from sibling to sibling and parent to child when it comes to their performance on intelligence tests. It's not entirely nature-based. There seem to be some environmental factors at play. But when looking at the data, it's pretty tough to argue that there aren't some genetic factors that are at play when people perform at different levels on intelligence tests. But what those genetic factors specifically are is debatable. One of the things that's sometimes discussed in the field is this concept of something called evocation. How just looking a specific way, presenting yourself in a specific demeanor, might change the way others react to us. If we look smart or we look attentive, that might have an impact on the way that people treat us. And that look might have nothing to do with our inherent cognitive abilities, but over time, it might indeed create a situation where we might be more inclined to perform better on, say, an intelligence test because of those genetic predispositions to look a specific way. This is also something that could be kind of highlighted in some of the research that shows that even though the overlap from child to parent is not super high when we're young when it comes to intelligence measures, as overlaps become more and more consistent and more aligned with our parents as we get older. Sort of speaking to the possibility that either genes take a while to work, or genes, in this case, could be more about evocation or other societal things that are pushing us to kind of find this high amount of heritability in these measures of intelligence. If we're looking for other things that really highlight the fact that there are some types of kind of environmental factors at play, there's lots of research that's shown that low intelligence levels are often a byproduct of societal things that people can encounter. There's lots of research that's shown that impoverished environments, that doesn't mean poor environments, but ones that don't have a lot of mental stimulation, can be very detrimental to a child's performance, not only at a young age when they're taking intelligence tests, but at a latter age as well. Numerous studies that looked at this first focused their attention on what would happen to rats in their learning abilities when they didn't have lots of stimuli around them. Later studies looked at schooling systems and societal issues where children weren't given the same cognitive stimulation as others. And they showed, to a much lesser effect, nonetheless showed that a lot of the things that were found in rat research was also found in societal comparison studies, where those that simply don't get the mental stimulation at a young age tend to show deficits in their performance on intelligence tests. And this research also shows that if you do create enriched environments for anybody, not just those that are struggling, but also those that were right on the average when they're young, well, those enriched environments can impact a pretty dramatic uptick in a person's performance on these intelligence tests within a matter of months to years. There's also research that's shown that missing things like school can have a really detrimental impact on a child's performance on intelligence tests, and that these impacts can indeed linger for a long period of time. And all of these things are still being looked at from different angles by people in educational psych and in psychology in general to really try to tease apart this concept of heritability and some of the social factors that might be at play in our intelligence test performance. One of the last things I want to mention, just kind of focus on, is this really cool effect that does highlight the importance of the environment when it comes to intelligence test performance, and it's something called the Flynn effect. It was something that was actually discovered back in the late 80s, early 90s, if I recall correctly. It's a fact that as intelligence tests were being devised and sort of being updated, researchers were starting to notice that to create these standardized tests, to allow people to be compared to each other, they had to make the tests harder and harder with each successive generation. In essence, what they found was that if somebody in the 1990s took a test from the 1930s, they'd probably do really, really well on it. In fact, almost everybody in the 90s would do so well on it that it would be really tough to distinguish scores from one person to another in the 90s if they were still using a test from back in the 1930s. Essentially, everybody would rock it. So what they had to do to make the tests more standardized, to allow them to compare people in more nuanced ways, was to continually make the tests more and more challenging. And this didn't just happen once. This was something that successfully happened almost every single year, where they had to tweak the test just a little bit to make them more challenging for over 5 decades. And in fact, it wasn't until the mid-2000s where something really interesting happened. Until that point, the tests were continually getting more and more challenging. And then at around 2005 to 2010, we got to a point where we had kind of capped out. Intelligence tests no longer needed to be made more challenging for individuals. There wasn't a need to kind of bring things up to kind of get the averages where things needed to be. And then as time progressed, a really surprising thing relating to this Flynn effect occurred. For the very first time, in the early 2010s, the test needed to be made slightly easier for people to be compared a little bit better. And this trend has continued for a while. It's not that we're back to the 1930s in this year 2021. We're not there yet, and in fact, we'll probably go back to that place because there's a lot of things like proper healthcare systems, educational programs that seemed to ensure that we'll never kind of get to that point where the average is way down to where it was. But these subtle, small shifts that are a byproduct of environmental factors and things that are going on in society really highlight again that even if we say intelligence is a very heritable thing, there are other factors at play. And these effects really can give us insights into some of the things that kind of impact a person's intelligence levels, or at least their performance on an intelligence test, in ways that maybe we can't forecast without that data itself. Okay. So I think we've probably hit a good place to end this lecture with lots of food for thought and some really interesting tidbits that I'm hoping you can appreciate as much as many of the early psychologists did. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, since we are reaching the end of this intelligence topic, we're reaching the finish line for a lot of different things, both our exploration of cognitive psychology and our progression through the different topics that have a natural succession to each other so far. In our next class, we're going to be transitioning to looking at new areas of psychology that popped up as other ones that we've been looking at continued to explore the topics that they were looking at. In particular, we're going to spend some time in our next class talking about social psychology, though we'll be going well beyond that as we reach the finish line for the class. So I hope everybody's doing well. I hope this lecture made sense and it was riveting in the same way that it was for me when I was an undergrad and got to learn about this stuff. And, well, I hope to get to see many of you soon and that you're all hanging in there. For today, I'll just say take care. Goodbye.